Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, Senior Internal Audit Advisor at Audit Board, and welcome to another in my continuing series, Agents of Change. I'm joined today by Aaron Gagnon, the Chief Audit Executive of McKinsey and Company. Aaron comes to us with a wealth of knowledge and experience gained from over 30 years in the internal audit space. That includes stops as the Chief Audit Executive of Apple, as well as Abercrombie and Fitch. Aaron, welcome to Agents of Change.
Thank you. Appreciate you inviting me.
You know, Aaron, I wrote the book, Agents of Change, about those internal auditors who are catalysts for transformation that helps to create value for the organizations they serve. Most people don't think of internal auditors as being value creators or value enhancers. They just think of them as being the value protector. But what's your view? Is it appropriate for internal auditors to help the organization grow and achieve success other than just protecting the assets?
Absolutely. I think, a lot of us, we always talk about the assurance side and the advisory side, and I think that's a big part for us. I know my experience working with a couple different boards, they more and more want us to do that, and they want, obviously they're always trying to be careful to make sure we do our core responsibilities. There's a strong need for that. I worked formerly at Apple, and one of the things I remember, one of the Audit Committee members, we had a presentation at one point, and we were having more people ask for advisory work than we had capability, and we were trying to balance that with the amount of assurance level. And I remember she said to me, she's like, "This is how I know that you've been successful here. You've got more people asking for your help than we can provide." And I thought, that's what they look for.
Right, and it's interesting because that's a performance metric that I think is one that's underutilized. There's a lot of debate. Even at a conference that I've attended recently, internal auditors are saying, "Well, how should we measure our performance?" And there tends to be a lot of focus on outputs. How many audits did I do last year? What percent of the audit plan did I complete? But what you're talking about is one way of measuring your success might be how often the phone rings, or you get a text message or an email asking for help.
Yeah, part of that conversation was interesting. It was a conversation to say, here's all the requests. On the advisory side, here's what I'm going to be doing. Here's what I'm not doing, right? Where it's like the conversation of what are the things that we won't do on an advisory side, not because we can't, but because limited capacity, here's how I've prioritized it.
When I talk about agents of change in internal audit, I talk about the fact that if you want to be an agent of change, you've got to start at home. That is within internal audit itself. Now, I know that you've been a transformational agent in the internal audit functions that you've led. Can you share any perspectives, any insights, any stories about how you might have been that change agent when you took over an internal audit function?
Yeah, I think, actually at Abercrombie and Fitch, then at Apple, and then at McKinsey, all three of those came with a mandate of we want something different, right? And looking for really something that was going to be different. And it really is, you kind of come in, and at this point I feel like I kind of have a little bit of a playbook on how to do this, where you kind of come in and say, hey, where are we today? You go and you meet with all the key stakeholders and say, what is it that you want? I kind of joke a little bit and say, do you want chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry? It's all ice cream and it all tastes good, but which version do you want, right? And so figuring that piece of it out and then working through and coming up with a strategic plan on how do we get there, right? Where are the gaps and where do we want to be? How do we get ourselves to that, putting that roadmap out there? So I think you're right. I think that first step is to say, well, let's kind of get our house in order. Before we can go out and help the rest of the organization, we need to get ourselves in a good place. We need to build the reputation, right? You need to build that reputation, and it's not always just the reputation, but or relationships, but it's relationships of trust and getting that built. So for me, it's first, let's get our house in order. Then the next step for me was like, how do you build those relationships? Part of the relationship building, I think, is being open with people in the business. People are more willing to share with you when you share with them. For us, for a lot of people, internal audit's a black box. All they know is you show up and they're like, and I get an audit report and I have no idea what's going on and how you came up with it. But if you open up and say, hey, here's the audit process, here's how this works. And when I started at Apple, and I've done the same thing at McKinsey, which is to kind of do a little bit of a roadshow on, hey, let me just demystify internal audit for you. And here's what it is. Here's what we can do from an assurance perspective. Here's what we can do from an advisory perspective. And really helping educate the folks along kind of what that journey is. I think once you've done that, and a lot of times I will share with them, hey, here's my quarterly audit report that I'm giving to the board. Everybody's interested in that. If you're the head of the information security or you're the head of some part in the business, sharing that with them, and I think people are more willing to share with you and say, here's the things that are important to me. And you start getting that relationship where they're like, you get a senior vice president says, hey, can you go look at this for me? And you start to have the question of, do you want me to look at this from an assurance perspective? And a lot of times you get that request, like, yeah, I want an audit done, right? Let me know how this is going. Or, hey, I know I have an opportunity. Can you work with our team to improve the controls in this space? So I think that's how you kind of build that up and really kind of help create that change. You can't start with that last part. You got to start with the internal, to your point, of getting your house. You didn't say house in order, but
Right.
maybe that's the way to think about it.
Any speed bumps that you hit as you were trying to come into these new organizations and get everybody to kind of rethink internal audit?
Yeah, it's funny because I'd like to talk about stuff at Apple, which was kind of interesting because if you don't mind me, just a little bit of a story,
please.
but it was interesting at Apple. They had an internal audit team that had pretty much done SOX work and had done fraud work. And to be quite fair, they were really good at it. It's probably the best SOX program I've ever seen, even my time at Ernst & Young and other places. And so they did that really well. Mm-hmm. 2 new board members came in and said, that's great, but that's not internal audit, and we really need an internal audit function. And I think the person who was running internal audit, or what ultimately was a SOX program, had some ideas on, hey, I don't issue audit reports, I don't have an audit plan, and I think he had some, I think had been burned by some things in the past and had shaped his view, but obviously it's not the mainstream view of how you do internal audit. So anyway, so the new board members come in and say, hey, that's not internal audit. They came from regulated spaces and said, we need something different. And so I actually ended up going and meeting with one of these audit committee members, and they said, I went for a 45-minute meeting. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours, this audit committee member said, hey, listen, we're going to give you a blank piece of paper and a blank check. Don't be shy. They have $260 billion in cash. Now, the CFO didn't agree with that, but as you can imagine, but basically said, hey, come back. You're going to come back to us in 6 months, and you're going to tell us what this organization needs to look like, how much management needs to write the check for, and you're going to do this at the largest market cap company in the world. And I thought, that's the best sales pitch I've ever heard in my life. Right. Sign me up, right? So it was coming into that and that environment. So we talk about speed bumps, getting back to your question here. I think that was driven by the audit committee, people who had come from an outside point of view that said, this isn't internal audit, this is what internal audit should be, and giving that guidance to management. I think it was a little bit of a challenge for the CFO at first because they had a lot going on. I mean, the company was growing at a crazy pace, 30-something% a year for multiple years. And, this was not what he wanted to deal with, right? He was trying to deal with the revenue side of the house. So I think he was a little bit, like, okay, we'll do what you want to do, but not as excited about it. But I think after we were able to demonstrate, kind of get that in place, demonstrate the value, where we had people his peers coming and asking for our help. I remember about 2 years into that, he was like, okay, Aaron, I got it. I see the value. He even said it in front of the audit committee. He was like, I kind of did this kicking and screaming, but I'm totally on board, and I totally understand why we need to go this direction, and actually valued what we brought to the table. Right. So
that's a great success story. So you've described these roles that you came into, and your first order of business was this sort of transformational change. But then once you were there and got through that, was there a need for a strategic plan? Because I know the new IA standard 9.2, requires the CAE to develop and lead develop a strategic plan and lead the organization by that strategic plan. What's your experience been with that?
Yeah, I think at the Apple, when I was at Apple, I think the example there would be, at the beginning was just like, how do we build, right? We got to start from, we're building the foundation of a house. How do we put that down, right? But I think a couple years into it really was kind of coming back with, hey, here's our strategic plan of what does this look like down the road? I think sometimes as CAEs, we get a little bit lost in here's my 1 year plan. And it's very limited as to where you're trying to go. It's like, hey, I'm just trying to deliver what I got to deliver, right? I really do think that that longer year strategy is not so much about, hey, what are all the audits I'm going to do, but hey, where are we today? I love I think the IAA puts out this framework on it's a maturity of an internal audit organization. But looking at things like that, where you can say, hey, where are we today and how do we get to that next level? And that's not really about completing audits. That's about how do we improve, elevate our talent, how do we improve our technology usage, how do we have more impact around the company that we work with. And so I think that strategy is important, and your audit plan kind of comes out of that. And that strategy, you need to, to quote Inception, dream a little bigger, darling. And try to think about, hey, how does that look down the road, right? What's that vision for the future? And that's the challenge for a lot of us CAEs is to, hey, step out of this year and think about where we're going to be in 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I think, again, of the four characteristics that we identified for change agents, that strategic mindset, I think, is the one that a lot of audit leaders really need to focus on, because the idea that I can manage tactically year after year after year, I think, is why a lot of them really burn out in their role.
Yep.
Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to be able to talk to you, and you've given us some great insights on what it takes to be an agent of change in a new role as a CAE. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us for another in our continuing series, Agents of Change. I'm Richard Chambers, Senior Internal Audit Advisor at Audit Board.